Hey, first of all, shout out to my sister who made this really awesome crochet version of my gecko Korok. You should definitely check out her Etsy shop. I will link it in the description. She does all sorts of cool crocheted frogs and isopods and all that sort of thing. Today we're doing something really cool. We're making a new Vivarium bioactive terrarium for my gecko. So the issue with the last terrarium, I accidentally didn't measure correctly, and the tank was like 1 or 2 inches too tall for the space that I had picked out. So I got this new tank that's just a little bit less tall that actually fits in the space perfectly. I also decided to do a voiceover because it's just way easier than worrying about mics and stuff while you're working. And this project also took like 4 days over 2 weekends, so it was just way easier to film it and not have to worry about, narrating it at the same time. What I'm doing is creating a something for the expanding foam background to like mount onto, since the expanding foam doesn't like stick super well to the glass itself. Some people do like just a silicone, they just like spread silicone on the back of the tank, which maybe would have been better because I didn't really like how much extra like space that this purple foam took up. Like, I wasn't super happy about that. But anyways, the main purpose was to give the expanding foam something to stick to and hopefully also make it a bit easier to remove if I ended up hating the background or having to sell the tank or whatever. But I don't think in the end that would have like mattered too much. Anyways, right now I'm just tracing out the size for the panels. I didn't measure it. I didn't think it was super critical considering all this stuff is gonna get covered anyways. And then once I had one panel, I just kind of used it as a guide for the other 2 panels. I decided to cover like the back 3 frames. And I'm just using like a hot knife that I heated up on the stove to cut the foam. It was very effective. I don't know if it's recommended to do that like indoors or whatever, but anyways, it worked really well. You should like probably be wearing a mask when you're handling any of this stuff that I was working with, but I did not do that. I tend to be pretty sensitive to like chemicals and stuff, and I do get headaches, but I didn't get a headache at all after doing this project, so I think it was okay. If you're interested, you can go and watch the first tank build that I did for Korok. There was nothing like wrong with that tank, but I wasn't like 100% happy with the background. Like it definitely took a lot less time. That only took me like an afternoon, and this took much longer. But I always wanted to try like the expanding foam background that seems to be pretty popular in like the terrarium building community. And I should say too that I'm like no expert with this. I was just, trying this for the first time. I probably could have watched more videos from other people, but sometimes you just gotta learn by doing it yourself. So that was this project. It was just learning to do something new. One of the comments I did get a lot in my first video was that the tank was too big for Korok, like too big for a baby crested gecko, and that is something that I like researched before I put the tank together. A lot of times they do recommend smaller tanks for small geckos and to increase the tank size as the gecko grows. The main reason for that, as far as I could tell, was just because the babies can have a hard time finding food if the tank is like too big for them. So I was aware of that when I built the first tank. I just monitored really closely whether Korok was actually finding and eating his food and weighing him regularly. Like, that wasn't that hard to do because with the crested gecko diet that you feed them, you can see how much they've eaten and how much they've like licked up. It's like not that hard to tell. So he was like 11 grams, I think, when I brought him home. And now I think he's just over 30 grams. He was growing consistently. I think by the time I put that video, the original video together, like he had already grown to be almost 20 grams. So I was prepared to like downsize him to a smaller container if I needed to, but honestly, I didn't need to, and I didn't want to make extra work for myself and like do multiple terrariums if I didn't have to. So here I'm just using some aquarium silicone to stick the foam panels onto the back. Aquarium silicone, I got this at my local pet store that carries a lot of like aquarium stuff. It was like $20 a tube, which is pretty pricey. I think I used like 3 tubes of silicone for this project and I ran out. Like I should have had a lot more silicone. 3 tubes was like not even enough. I did do like a lot of reading on different forums of like, can you use other silicone that isn't labeled as aquarium silicone? And some people said yes and some people said no, and it was really hard to find like a conclusive answer. Apparently you can use anything that's 100% silicone and doesn't have any additives. So anything that doesn't have things like mildew resistance in it. But reading the labels of different tubes at the store, like it was really hard to figure out, okay, what doesn't actually have any additives. So I did use a tube for one of this. Actually, I think 2 of them were not technically aquarium silicone. I only had the 1 tube of aquarium silicone. In the end, I think it was okay. I would probably be more careful to use only the aquarium silicone if I was making like an actual aquarium or something for my dart frogs that are more sensitive. But I don't think for a crested gecko it's going to be as critical. That's kind of just my take on it. I was actually like super frustrated during this part of the project. I'm using this like random metal shovel tool that I had that's meant for plants and whatever to like smooth out the edges of the silicone. Now, like I bought months ago an actual kit that has like all the tools for smoothing out silicone, and I spent like over an hour looking for it and I could not find them anywhere. So I was like so just annoyed at this part of the project. What you don't see is that like in between the cuts, the silicone actually like partially hardened. Like the aquarium silicone dries or cures pretty quickly, so it was already starting to like harden when I was scraping it. So it did like it just did not work. And silicone also doesn't like stick to itself once it's cured. So this was just a mess. And like the irony of the whole situation is that it didn't end up mattering anyways because all of this stuff just got covered with expanding foam. So really all I needed to do was press the silicone into the cracks. I didn't need to like make it smooth or whatever. I spent like way too much time on this and way too much emotional energy for something that just got covered up. So if you don't have the right tools for this step, it doesn't actually matter. Note to self. Oh yeah, and then the other thing that happened was in the process of searching for the tools, I also lost my glasses. So then I couldn't see anything and I was just like so frustrated. Moving on, this part actually was fun. Finding the best way to fit the pieces of cork in that I bought. I just got these at, again, my local pet store that sells reptile stuff as well. The top was too big on that one piece, so I just broke it and then it fit perfectly. Don't ever throw out any pieces of cork that you break off or whatever. They're really good for like filling little bits and pieces later, or if they're big enough, you can even use them to like mount staghorn ferns and that kind of stuff on. So keep all the little pieces, not the tiny pieces, but anything that's like big enough to use, make sure you keep it even if it's for a new project later. The reason we use cork is because it's water resistant, so it's not going to mold in your terrarium, at least not very quickly. Like it's going to take a long time to break down. I'm using silicone here to actually stick it onto the background. The thing with cork, it's not usually like perfectly flat, so you kind of want to just put the silicone on the high points of the cork and then fill in around the edges. That's kind of the best thing that you can do. I think the more area of your background you can actually cover with cork, the better it's gonna look. The amount of cork I used, it cost me about $50, I think, and I got it from my local pet store that carries reptile stuff. You can usually get it at a place like that. They sell it by the pound, I think, so it'll be by weight, and you can just get whatever sizes kind of work for what you're doing. I think these tall pieces really worked well in the kind of vertical terrarium that I was building. And cork is pretty light and easy to easy to break without needing a saw because the pieces are so thin. That's what I ended up doing. Like, I didn't want to use fancy tools or anything. So if you do have a piece that's too big, like I did, it's really easy to just break it off, and then you won't have a problem. Here, I'm just using some cups to create some cavities where I can plant plants into later. It's way easier to do it at the beginning than it is to try and carve out little cavities later, and then the design looks a bit more intentional and balanced if you can kind of visualize it and plan it out in this stage, not try and fit the plants in at the end. You will see this happen a few times in the project where my cork pieces were just like not sticking. The aquarium silicone is sticky, but it can't hold a lot of weight, especially this piece that I'm putting on right now. Because it doesn't have anything really supporting it from the bottom, it fell off like so many times. You'll see. I think often when like professionals are building these kinds of terrariums, they will have supports underneath, so they'll use like extra pieces of wood or stuff like that to prevent the pieces from falling down. Like sometimes they'll also incorporate branches and stuff into the background, but eventually I just put enough silicone on this thing that it did manage to stick. I guess I could have also had someone like hold it in place, but I would have had to hold it in for like 20 minutes or something before it was even remotely strong enough to hold itself. But anyways, eventually we got there. I tried not to cut out too much stuff from this video that could be considered like a mistake. I just really wanted to kind of present it as it is, with the, the challenges and the ups and downs and things not always going according to plan. See, like here, I walk away and it is gonna fall. So totally not impressed, but eventually with enough silicone, it will stick. I'm just putting another little cup over here on the other side as well. I kind of wanted to have 3 in total, 2 on one side and 1 on the other. And I was siliconing those in place so that I can put all the expanding foam in around them, and then it'll be nice and secure and ready for putting plants in. If you're going to do this, I would definitely recommend using cups that don't have holes in the bottom, so not like just a nursery pot or something, because you don't really want water and the roots growing down in behind your background, because you're never going to be able to clean that, and if there's a leak or there's issues, you're just never going to be able to fix it. So yeah, highly recommend sealing it all up using something that is solid, and then if you want to put a nursery pot or something inside of that, go for it. But you don't like need drainage in those spots. I think it'll just be like detrimental for you in the long run. And now we're adding even more silicone to try and get that stupid piece of cork to stay. Be very, very generous with your silicone in this stage. I think I used about 1 tube just for this kind of background piece. Also, do not touch the silicone with your fingers. You need to at least be using gloves. I think, oh, and there it goes again. Yep, of course. You can use a tool to like squish the silicone around and kind of get it onto the edges of your cork. But yeah, please don't use your fingers. I should have been wearing like not good clothes for this whole step. You don't want to get silicone on your skin or on your clothes, and you especially do not want to get the expanding foam on your hands or your clothes, which I unfortunately learned the hard way. This is the absolute worst stuff to get off ever. Like, nothing dissolves it. I tried acetone, I tried all this kind of stuff. Literally nothing will get it off. If you get it on glass, okay, it's fine because you can kind of scrape it off. But if you get it on your skin or on your clothes, it's not going anywhere. So this was a huge mistake to do this. 1, in nice clothes, and 2, to not be wearing gloves. And it gets even worse, as you'll see. But the actual application itself was like not too bad. You definitely want to have the nozzle like close to the surface so that it actually has something to stick to. But as long as it has something to stick to, like, it holds itself up pretty well. Now, when I was watching other people's videos, mostly like after the fact, a lot of people will tip the terrarium on its like on the back so that you're not working vertically, or like working horizontally, and that probably would have been smart. Maybe it doesn't matter as much for this foam phase because, like I said, it does like hold itself up pretty well. But for the next stage, you'll see once we start putting the coco coir on the foam, that probably would have been a lot easier. I was kind of afraid of breaking the terrarium, but in the end, it might have been a bit better. But for this phase, it was okay. I have seen some people use, instead of this type of foam, same brand, but it's like a pond. It's like a pond filler. It's like called Pond and Stone or something like that, and it's black, and I don't think it expands quite as much. It might not also be like as sticky, but it's like meant for outside applications. I've seen a lot of people use that, and that seems like it works really well, and the texture that you end up with is really good. So if I was going to do this again, I would probably use the Pond and Stone filler. And I think that one, from the videos I've seen, doesn't like stick to itself or stick to other stuff quite as well as this one does. So in that case, you would probably want to be working like horizontally. Anyways, this whole step was like super fun, despite the chaos of like trying to clean it up afterwards. Like, this was probably my favorite part of the whole process, like piping the foam onto the background. And I think you really can't go wrong with it. If it does get like too thick, you can basically carve it down in the next step. Now I think about here is where things start going very severely downhill, because you see I kind of like tip the nozzle, because I'm pretty sure on the package it says that you can tip the nozzle instead of like having to turn the can upside down or whatever, like that the nozzle should be somewhat flexible. Well, anyways, it was not, and it was like kind of working for a while, as you can see, but then the foam starts like coming out the spot where it broke, and that was just complete. That was just a mess. Like, it was going pretty well up until that point, and then filling in these last couple gaps was just not fun. You can see what a mess that it's making. And look, when I go and press it, now none of it is coming out the nozzle. It's all just coming out the side. So I had to kind of like scoop it up and pack it in the spots where I still needed, because I wasn't like quite done. This spot in particular, I was really trying to fill it in, and you see that I end up just kind of covering up that cup that was there completely with the idea that I would just go and like carve the foam out later. I did that because it was like really hard to get in that spot and make sure it was all filled in, and I wanted to make sure it was all filled in so that Korok couldn't like find a way to get in behind the cork, since it was pretty hollow underneath. And that's one of the problems with the previous tank that I built him, the cork. There was enough of a gap between the background and the cork that he could get in behind the cork. So that's where he liked to sleep every night. And so I never got to actually see him. It was only like when he would finally come out. And if I ever needed to get him out in an emergency or something, it was pretty difficult. So I was trying to make sure that all the gaps were filled in. I have to say, using the little tool to mush the foam in actually worked better than I was expecting. I thought it might burst all the bubbles, but it actually turned out okay. And this was the finished result like a day later. The foam actually expanded a lot more than I was even anticipating, which again added a bit more thickness to the background than I really wanted. I should have gone and like carved away more of the background with an X-Acto knife, but I didn't really think of it. And I just used a glass scraper to get off any of the bits that ended up where they weren't supposed to be. Now I'm going in and trying to find the plastic cup that is in this blob somewhere. I used a little craft precision knife because that's basically all I could find, but an actual construction X-Acto knife probably would have been better. You can kind of see here just how dense that foam actually cures. Like, it's quite hard and sturdy once it cures, which is a good thing. It was actually, I think, more difficult than I was expecting to get this little cup out of here, but eventually I found it. I just worked for a bit to make sure the hole was actually, big enough that I could get a plant in there. And then I kind of filled up the hole with some of the excess pieces of foam until I couldn't like stick my hand kind of in behind the cup so that Korok couldn't get in behind there and hide on me. The way the lid fit on this terrarium, I had to kind of make slots where the little clasps or whatever those little plastic pieces are called could go so that the lid could actually close. So I just spent some time making holes for that. You can also see I learned my lesson and I'm wearing not good clothes today. I'm wearing my work clothes or painting clothes. Even though this step was not super messy after the foam had cured, it was fine. And now we've reached the next big step of covering up all of that foam with coco coir. And to do that, we put a layer of silicone down. At least that's the main way that I've seen other people do it. So basically you pipe out a whole bunch of silicone and then you can use a brush or like a silicone tool to just mush it around and make sure it gets into all of those nooks and crannies. Now, I should have used way more silicone here than I did. You'll see I put the coco coir down, but it doesn't like stick in all areas as well as it should have. Like it was kind of patchy. And I was trying to, at first, conserve the amount of silicone that I had because I realized that it probably wouldn't be enough. But if you don't put enough down, the coco coir is just not going to stick very well. I also really wish I had actually gone and like carved down the foam so there weren't so many bumpy bits and rounded bits and like uneven bits. I guess I didn't want to do that because I kind of liked the bumpy surface and I thought it might be more natural than if I went and started like flattening it out a bit, but I have seen other people do that and it looks good. So I think that I should have done that. It would have also helped so that it didn't end up being so thick. I was doing the coir application in sections because the silicone does cure pretty fast or starts to harden pretty fast anyways. And I didn't want to risk it curing before I got all of the coco coir on because that makes it even more difficult. The silicone doesn't really like to stick to itself, so I figured it would be better to do it this way in sections. That at least was not, I think, a bad decision. Again, it definitely would have been easier to get it in all the nooks and crannies if I had flipped the terrarium on its back. At this point, at least, I did start using a bit more silicone, and I think the coir stuck way, way better. I had to go back and redo a bunch from the first section. Another really important thing to note is that your coco coir has to be completely dry to do this section. I think I'm using some, I think it's called Eco Earth. One of the reptile brands, or possibly multiple reptile brands, sell this as like a substrate. I do normally use the compressed cocoa fiber bricks, but the problem with that is to decompress it, you have to add water basically. So it would take a long time for it to dry out, and it's not going to stick to the silicone if it's at all wet. So that is really key. You don't want the compressed bricks for this project, or at least you have to kind of prepare them a while in advance of actually putting the tank together. I do believe at this point I was on my second tube of silicone, and it was running out fast with the amount I was using. If you can get your hands on a silicone that is colored black instead of clear, I think that would have been good. Like, it would have been better because I would have been able to actually see which areas were being covered. And I think black, if the coco coir didn't stick to it, the black underneath would have looked better. Like, it would have looked more rock-like, whereas the yellow expanding foam with clear over top of it just looks super, super unnatural. So if you don't cover all of it, then you can like really tell. In the background here, you can kind of see my current frog tank and the stand that it's on, and then Korok's tank beside it. So it should have, like, the tank I bought, the Exoterra tank, looked like it would have fit underneath, but you can kind of see that there's like a shelf underneath of the frog tank for putting, you know, timers and all of the cords and stuff on. And with that shelf, it was just like a couple inches too tall. So thankfully I found this tank that was just the right height. This one is from PetSmart. I think it's their brand of terrarium. It's like a budget terrarium. I think it cost me $150 new. The base, like where the substrate is, it's not as deep as the Exoterra terrarium. The bottom panel is also not glass, but you know, overall I was pretty happy with it, and Korok hasn't escaped after having it for a few months, so I mean, that's a plus. Hopefully you can tell just like how much more silicone I'm using in this section versus the first section. It made a huge difference in actually getting the coco coir to stick. You should also be able to see the nice beak-shaped bruise I have on my arm. I think I was carrying a spray bottle, and River really does not like spray bottles at all. He's usually, you know, super friendly and chill, but some things just kind of trigger him, and one of those things is spray bottles. So I got a nice bite on the arm, which is just the reality of parrot ownership sometimes. I have to work on systematically desensitizing him to the spray bottles, so we're working on it along with, you know, a few other things. But yeah, shout out to River. At this point, the background was at least really starting to take shape, which was definitely super encouraging considering the frustration of it. but you can kind of get the idea now. Once it's covered with coco coir, it does start to look really, really good and really natural. And I was very excited, starting to get excited about the finished product. I don't think brushing off all of this stuff was actually, important, but anyways, it kind of helped the silicone to stick. I don't know. I was also starting to brush off the areas that had already cured to see where I still needed to go back and fill in. Later on, I kind of used like an air canister, an air duster. That actually worked pretty well too. That way I wasn't like knocking off things with the paintbrush that were like partially attached. The air was a little bit more gentle in that respect. I definitely started to care less as the project went on and was a little bit sloppier with the silicone, and it didn't really matter. Didn't seem to matter at all if the silicone and the coco coir mixed. So I don't think this is definitely not a project where you have to be super careful and precise. At this point, I had pretty much just used up my last tube of silicone, so I was really trying hard to get this last section covered, knowing that I did not have the amount that I needed, and it was a struggle. I think I actually switched to like a half tube that I had used for a different project, but it wasn't really the right stuff. It wasn't as nice and malleable as the actual aquarium silicone. So I was trying to use that. Definitely this last part, it would have been just so much easier if I had had enough aquarium silicone to begin with versus trying to piece it all together. But at least the coco coir was sticking. Another great example of how chaotic this project was. So after I ran out of my half tube of silicone, or realized that it wasn't working very well, I went to see if this little tube of aquarium silicone that I knew I had anything left in it. I had used this to kind of fill I think some leaks in my frog vivarium at some point. So I had a little bit left, and this is what I was saying about the black silicone. Way easier to see what areas you've covered. And because I had so little of it, I was just using it to cover these like little areas that I missed, and kind of, I think at some point I actually switched to using like a little spatula to like squish it on and like spatula it into the little crevices and stuff. This whole process of trying to cover up all of the little gaps and places that I missed to begin with, it was so tedious and time consuming, and it would have been way better if I could have just done it right the first time and had enough silicone. But it made my life so much easier. So if there's one thing I take away from this project, it's make sure you have enough silicone to begin with. 3 tubes minimum to do a background like this. I have to say, I was pretty surprised when I was brushing the coco coir how well it did actually stick. So I do think the silicone plus coco coir method is a good one. I'm not really sure what else you would use to adhere the coco coir that would be like safe for reptiles and amphibians. I have seen some people throw the coco coir directly onto the pond and stone foam, so that might be a method that would work. I don't think it works for the regular polyurethane foam. I feel like I've watched other people attempt that and it hasn't worked. I think even if it takes a lot of silicone, in the end, the silicone plus coco coir method does work. And I know from having the tank set up for a couple months now that the plants will root into it. A lot of climbers just like something for support. So it actually does work pretty well. It doesn't retain like a ton of moisture, but if you have a high humidity environment, it doesn't really matter because the plant roots will latch on anywhere. With this being for a crested gecko tank, crested geckos don't actually like super high humidity. I think it's like 50% during the day and 75% overnight is kind of what they like. So in my experience, that's not really high enough to grow a lot of terrarium plants. For example, in my last build, I had some ficus pumila minima on the background, and I could not keep that alive because the humidity was just not high enough for those root systems. So I wasn't planning on this background being like covered with plants. It would be more aroids and stuff that would want something to climb along the background. But if you were making like a super high humidity tank, I think this method would work perfectly. I think you would have vines and creepers just covering the background in not very much time. But then on the other hand, is it actually worth it to put that much effort into a background? In my frog vivarium, it's just a piece of styrofoam kind of carved out to have hills and valleys and then covered with a sheet of coco coir, not this loose stuff. And I think that is very effective because it's so humid, it gets covered by all of the creeping plants and then you don't see it anyways. So I think you might as well do something like that is not going to require so much effort. And here is the final result after I ran out of silicone. So there's still a couple gaps, but it's like mostly covered. I was pretty happy with how it turned out at this stage. I did leave it for like a week to cure until I couldn't smell the silicone anymore before I kind of moved on. There's that air duster I was talking about, which was pretty effective, especially for getting the coco coir out of those cups for the plants. What I decided to do, because there were still a few little bits that I couldn't quite cover 100%, I decided to take sphagnum moss and kind of squish it into the little nooks and crannies that didn't get covered. In some places, I actually used like a little wire and pinned it into the background. That is a nice thing about foam, is you can pin stuff into it very easily. I think the ideal solution here would be to have like live moss or something like that, but like I talked about, the humidity is just not going to be high enough to maintain live moss. So like a dried moss would be the best way to go. And I kind of thought sphagnum would be a good idea because you can get these long fibers that are pretty easy to kind of manipulate. If you get it moist, it's a really good growing medium for plants that are kind of crawling up the background. So I think it is good for the like health of the terrarium. Now, in the end, I kind of decided that I didn't like the look of the sphagnum moss. So after leaving it for like a few weeks, I did end up replacing it with like some dried moss. You should be able to find that at like a reptile supply store. You don't want to use dried moss in an area that's going to be super moist though, because if it starts to mold, it's not not going to look that great. And the other thing with dried moss, if it is like a green color, it probably won't stay that color. If it's like a preserved moss, they usually tend to go kind of like yellow and brownish over time. But I kind of like that better still than the sphagnum moss. I thought the sphagnum moss was just kind of like too light, so it was too much contrast with the dark background. So here's how it looked when I took out the sphagnum moss and put in the preserved moss instead. I think it looked way, way better. A little bit harder to pin and get it to stay in place, but I really liked it, and I think Korok does too. So now it is time to disassemble the old tank. So you can see how much everything has grown. It was a mistake to put the Syngonium albo at the front of the tank. It is a very pretty plant, so I definitely want to keep it and reuse this one. The Syngonium batique in here that you'll see, not a fan of that one. You'll also see how the background, the ficus, the creeping ficus that was on there, has pretty much died off because I couldn't keep it humid enough. At the front, this is an Elaphoglossum metallicum, I think, which is beautiful. So definitely want to keep that one. It's a little begonia, Benigo pink, I believe. So all in all, most of the plants have been looking really good. I had a begonia Sinbad in there as well. You can just kind of see the stump of it there in the back. It was growing so crazy. It was completely at the top of the tank, so I had to chop it back and take a bunch of cuttings. So it was doing really well. It was actually doing too well. It just got way too big. Here, I'm just unwrapping a Scindapsus silver lady that I tried to grow around this piece of wood, but it wasn't really happening anyways. But I do really love that piece of wood and definitely want to reuse that. I was not super gentle with these plants, especially not with the Syngoniums. Like, Syngoniums have absolutely crazy roots. And you'll remember when I built this terrarium, I put in a layer of mesh, and of course some of the roots for the Syngonium anyways had grown through the mesh, so I had to really reef on it to get it out. I was a bit gentler with the fern because I really did not want to harm that one. The Dubia did terribly, so I just threw that one out. This is a Monstera Adansonii mint, I think. It also hasn't done that great, but maybe it'll do better in the new tank. Silver Lady, pretty good. The Begonia Sinbad was growing so tall that it stunted the Syngonium pink splash that was underneath of it. Had a really good root system. I was just checking for root mealybugs to make sure there was nothing before I introduced it into the new tank, and thankfully we were clear, but I did have some begonias that had them, so I was really kind of nervous about that. Taking out the little Benigo pinks, they got shaded underneath the Syngoniums as well, so they were pretty stunted and not very pink, but I figured I'd throw them into the new tank and just see how they did. Last, pretty much last was dealing with this Syngonium batique. You can just see how crazy the roots have gotten, which is the great thing about Syngoniums, but you do have to be careful if you're putting them in a terrarium because they grow so fast. I just threw this one out because honestly, I was really tired of it, and I think with the batique, they need a lot of light to actually look nice, to get that nice veining on them. So they can be pretty, but I was just so tired of it. And before you say like, oh, why don't you sell it? Like, I had this particular plant for sale on Facebook Marketplace for like so long and nobody went for it. So I just could not be bothered anymore. I did decide to just reuse the terrarium soil for the previous build, so if you want to know how I actually made the terrarium substrate, you can go back and watch my original video. It hasn't been in this tank for that long, so it's still got all its nutrients, and it also had some isopods and stuff that were still running around in there, which I was happy about. So I know it's already kind of inoculated with good bacteria and insects, so I'd much rather use a soil that I know is already kind of established versus making something from scratch, it would just be a waste. I was just trying to take out as many of these roots as possible. Like, look how crazy that is and how much it got like underneath the mesh, which is why I think you don't really need mesh if you don't want to. I'm not putting a mesh layer in this new terrarium because the base is a lot shorter, so I don't really have room for it. If you don't have a lot of space, I don't think you're really gaining anything by having a drainage layer and mesh. You're better off just having a really nice, well-draining substrate. And I haven't had any issues with rot in the new tank so far without the mesh layer. So I stand by that. I didn't remove the extra coco coir and sphagnum moss that had fallen down. I figured it might as well just become part of the substrate. I just kind of mixed it around. Probably should have been wearing gloves for this step, but anyways, it's just soil. You can kind of see the isopods running around in there too. I believe I have dairy cow isopods and powder orange isopods in here. Those are both really good because they're very hardy, and the dairy cows in particular breed very quickly, so they make for a great cleanup crew in a bioactive terrarium. So I definitely recommend those as like beginner isopods if you're building your own tank. And somehow Korok managed not to eat all of them, which was pretty impressive, but you can also feed them to your geckos as like extra calcium and stuff. Now I was just trying to position that piece of wood. It was a bit challenging because I had lost so much room on the back because of the thickness of the background. So I was struggling to like get it into the position that I wanted. I really liked how it was in my previous tank. It was definitely like my favorite part. So I was really trying hard to make it work. I ended up breaking off the top little piece, and then it fit much better. Then I didn't have as much issues, but there was a bit of back and forth, taking it out of the tank, trying to put it back in, trying to reposition it, but eventually I got it where I wanted it. And now we're finally into actually adding the plants. This is a really cool orchid that was on my wish list for a long time, so I'm hoping that it will do well in here in this spot. My only concern is that it might not get enough light, but sometimes you just have to leave something for a while to see. We just washed off all of the plants to get off any of Korok's poop. I wasn't too crazy with rinsing the roots off since it had already been in like the same substrate, and I wasn't really worried about pests since I already checked the roots when I got them out. It was more just a quick rinse to make sure all the plants were, didn't have dirt, didn't have other stuff on them, so they look nice. I put the Syngonium albo at the back of the tank this time. I figured the cork background and the coco coir would be perfect for the Syngonium to climb up on. I am slightly concerned that when I ever take the Syngonium out, that is going to rip apart my background, but I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The Elaphaglossum looks so good at the front of the tank. It comes off really blue on camera, which I'm happy about. The base of the Begonia Sinbad, I wasn't quite sure if it would survive, but I put it in anyways. Spoilers with the provision of having the tank for a few weeks already. It did not survive, but I put in some of the cuttings that I took from it and had rooted in water, so hopefully they will survive. At some point in the future, I may end up swapping out these plants or hopefully putting more begonias in the tank, depending on how these do. It is always a bit of a balance with a terrarium where you don't want things that grow too quickly because they can end up taking over, but obviously you want it to look nice and lush. I noticed in the previous tank the Scindapsus silver lady wasn't really growing up the wood like I had envisioned. It was actually more so creeping along the ground, and I actually really liked the way that looked. So I kind of tried to press the nodes into the soil to get it to be more of like a ground cover. And kind of hard to see what I'm doing here, but I had this single node / leaf of Microsorum thailandicum, the blue oil fern, that hasn't really been growing for me. I keep moving it around to different places, but it's a slow growing fern and has been kind of neglected. So I just thought for that third pot, I might just try and stick it in there because I think it would look super cool if it did end up surviving. Anyways, last but not least, I'm just cleaning up the tank, getting off any dirt. Magic erasers are honestly awesome for cleaning terrariums. Don't want to use harsh chemicals, obviously, when you're working with geckos or frogs or whatever. So usually just water and a magic eraser works perfectly. I also added some oak leaf litter. This is really good for isopods and springtails and just having a bioactive terrarium. Plus, they look cute, and Korok actually really loves to snuggle up and sleep in the leaves on the ground, so it's a win-win. I did collect these oak leaves myself and just sterilize them by baking them in the oven at low temperature. I've personally never had a problem with bugs after doing that. Now I'm just attaching Korok's feeding stand with his water and his food and just giving the whole tank a nice mist to give the plants a good start. And that's it. Time to introduce Korok to his new home. He's been hiding behind that piece of cork in his cage the whole time. And there he goes. He had no trouble getting used to his new home. And that's pretty much it. I was super happy with how this tank turned out. I'll give you a bit of a tour and then show you what the tank looked like a couple months later. Now, there was some plant die-off, but I mean, that is to be expected. Tanks like this will always look worse before they look better. For the lighting situation, I just have some, I think, Barina grow lights. 2 of them just kind of sat on top of the metal lid, which seems to be providing enough light so far. Please leave me your questions and comments. The only thing I don't want to hear is comments on how I care for my animals. If you're worried about River, for example, who is my sun conure that you might have seen flying around. He was not showing signs of distress at any point during the project. He was by a screen door that was open, so it was well ventilated. And Korok has been very happily living and growing in his new home. If you've stuck with me this long, thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking now and let you enjoy.